The balance of power hangs in the balance with the United States Senate. One surprising individual may have more clout than he's ever had. Senate Blue Dog, West Virginia centrist Joe Manchin, the new king of America, maybe amassing influence. Our next guest says progressives have just as much power, but questions are whether they're gonna use it.
Joining us to discuss is former National Press Secretary for the Sanders campaign, contributing editor to Current Affairs, and co-host of the Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray. Great to see you, Briahna.
Good to see you, Briahna.
It's always a pleasure.
So it is funny how it's automatically assumed, and I think rightfully so, that now suddenly Joe Manchin is going to control every piece of legislation that can potentially pass the Senate. But it could be the case on the other side if Sanders, Warren, some of the more progressive members of the Senate wanted to team up. They also could be in that power position. Do you think there's any possibility of that actually happening?
Do I think that there's any possibility of that actually happening? Well, let's look to recent history. What we saw just a few days ago was the conclusion of this force the vote conversation, where because of slim majorities in the House, progressive Democrats had an opportunity to extract some real big concessions in exchange for voting for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. Now, they have put out there, they have claimed that they did get some good concessions. AOC tweeted a list of committee appointments to a lot of breathless fanfare, but the reality is that of those appointments, only one was a new appointment. Cori Bush was the only new appointment to that progressive panel on the committee. There was a lot of fanfare around PAYGO exemptions, but the reality is that they were very limited in nature, only with respect to COVID and climate change, important issues to be sure, but having little to nothing to do with Medicare for all. So what we have seen is that where there is real opportunity for progressives to leverage power, they typically decline to do so. The 5 representatives who declined to vote for Nancy Pelosi were all moderate blue dog types. And for whatever reason, it seems like that faction, the Democratic Party, the Joe Manchins of the world, seem a lot more willing to use the power at their disposal.
Very true.
I've been really stunned by this entire thing, Briahna, because, these people entered with big pledges. And AOC famously sat in the speaker's lobby and all of that. And that really was like Tea Party style politics. Look, obviously I'm an outside observer, but I see how effectively Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows made John Boehner's life a living hell. He hated them with a fiery passion, and they didn't care. They actually made more money and got reelected on the backs of that. Why is it that we haven't seen the willingness to use this? Because as you point out, everybody else in Washington who represents a corporate caucus is always willing to be like, nope, I'm going to withhold my vote and I'll screw you at the next ballot box, except for many of these representatives. I really don't get it.
Yeah, it is confusing, in one part because they did run explicitly, many of them, on these issues, on particularly ousting Nancy Pelosi. Even recently, a couple of weeks ago, AOC told Jeremy Scahill at The Intercept in an interview that she does think that Pelosi and Democratic leadership needs to go. But when it comes down to brass tacks, rarely are Democrats willing to cross their party openly in the way that we have seen Republicans on occasion do. To your point about Nancy Pelosi's office in the sit-in that she did on the first day, her first day in Congress, that really put the Green New Deal on the map in a big way. We saw how effective that kind of demonstration is. And I believe it's because it's very rare in politics, particularly on the broad left, to have people name names and point directly to the corruption and malfeasance, political malfeasance of people within our own party. It's an incredibly powerful tool to publicly embarrass and put that kind of electoral pressure on someone of your own party. And I, for one, hope that Democrats, especially these progressives, who really postured and ran on and positioned themselves as being fundamentally beholden to the people that got them elected, start exercising the power that they truly do have in a House with such narrow Democratic majorities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, of course, though, when we're talking about the Senate, you've got the OG there, Senator Bernie Sanders, who still isn't technically a Democrat, as everyone on MSNBC will be quick to remind you, Briahna, who is set to become chairman of the Budget Committee. And he has shown a willingness at times to go against the grain, criticize Democratic leadership, and, go his own way. We saw some of that back in December with the fight over the check. So, do you think that he's in a position and willing to use that power to push things to the left?
Well, I'm not counting my chickens before they hatch. Let's see if this manifests. But look, Senator Sanders over the course of his career, has shown a great deal of willingness, more than most, to be oppositional to the Democratic Party. Most notably, as you point out, Crystal, by being outside of it and being willing to position himself as an independent. I do think that he showed more willingness to do so in 2016, at least rhetorically, than he did in 2020, which was part of why his candidacy landed a little differently. There was a lot more open talk about his opponent, Hillary Clinton's corruption, party corruption, taking money from banks, Wall Street speeches, those kinds of things. Whereas in 2020, there was a softer approach, a lot of discussion of Joe Biden being his friend. And at one point, when a surrogate, Zephyr Teachout, explicitly described Joe Biden as corrupt in an article, the campaign didn't stand by that particular article in The Guardian. So I'm curious to see how that will manifest at this stage, but I do think it's something for all people across the political aisle to consider, is whether or not the people who are fighting for them are willing to be consistent about pointing out bad acts within their own party, particularly when it comes to the influence of money and politics and corruption.
Yeah. I mean, Bri, I also wanted to ask you a little bit more specifically about Georgia, because Democrats tried something new here and actually ran on something specific and material to people's economic well-being, which was the $2,000 checks. And what's more, the candidate of all four who performed the best is Reverend Warnock, who I think without a doubt, judging by his current and his past statements, is the most progressive. This was shared by James Medlock on Twitter. Here's Reverend Warnock in a sermon making the case for socialized health care.
I'm so sick and tired of all of these folk talking about socialistic medicine. You're giving in to socialism. And I really get upset when I hear Christians in the midst of this debate talking about socialism. They ought to go back and read Acts chapter 2, where the Bible says that the church had all things in common. We don't have all things in common, but certainly we have some things in common, and there are some things that you can't build a gate around. There are some things you can't protect yourself from by living inside of a gate. When H1N1 breaks out, all of a sudden people forget about socialized medicine and they go and try to get a vaccine wherever they can get it, however they can get it, whenever they can get it. They'll stand in a long line. They'll leave their gated community and make their way to a free clinic in order to get an H1N1 vaccine.
Now, What's really funny is that this was actually unearthed by right-wing people who were like, oh my God, look at this, isn't this terrible, right? And it's also exactly the kind of rhetoric that establishment Democrats would always be, oh my God, you can't say that. You'll never get elected, especially in a tough seat, with that kind of record. And yet, here's Reverend Warnock about to be the first ever black senator from the state of Georgia.
Yeah, Warnock is in a lot of ways a repudiation of all of the narratives that we heard after Election Day, right? That Joe Biden was hurt by all of the talk of socialism in Florida, that the defund the police movement was a real albatross around his neck. When the reality is, what we see is what got Warnock across the finish line was an enormous door-knocking effort, something that Joe Biden had abandoned, the use of volunteers and organizations that were local to the state, that had longstanding ties to a community, and yes, progressive messaging, running explicitly on making people's lives better. And let's not forget how aided both candidates likely were with the Democrats finally embracing the $2,000 checks. Note, please, that Joe Biden never did that, never was even asked directly about whether or not he supported either a singular or recurring $2,000 monthly checks until December 29th, 2020, a failure of our media establishment as well as our political establishment. So yes, running on good things for people works.
Yeah, who would have
Incredible insight. Briahna, so great to see you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Next on Rising, journalist Glenn Greenwald. He's going to join us to discuss the blocked extradition of Julian Assange to the United States. That when Rising returns.